Well, really great to see you, John. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to flip you around so you can see the class.
Great.
All right, there you go. So everybody, I'm very excited to introduce John Downing. Dr. John Downing is the director of Minnesota Sea Grant. Oops, can't get your camera to stay, but all right, good enough. And he is also my PhD advisor at Iowa State University. But he has lots and lots and lots of fantastic, creepy lake stories, which is what he's going to share with us today. So I'm very excited to welcome John to talk to us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate being here. Yeah, I guess there's a big me on the screen. Hi. Good to see you all there. And I was just going to say that Halloween is my very favorite holiday, and I hope you guys like it too. It's the only time every year that you get to be somebody completely different, which is really fun. But the other part is it's gotten even better during the pandemic because, wearing a mask has gotten almost natural now. So that kind of makes it all easier. So I'm going to share, I think if I can, I will share a little PowerPoint and show you some creepy pictures and talk about some of the strange limnology stories that I've run across. I mean, I have a fair number of them, and I warned Mindy that I'd added a few more things to it, and I think I've got an explanation for some of them. But let me see if I can just share something and see if I can do it successfully, which I don't seem to be able to do. Why? Oh, there it is. Here we go. And now do you see just a slide of me as a ghost?
That's correct.
Okay, yeah. So this is me. Back when I thought being a ghost would be funny. And there are also pictures of me on the web as a zombie and a variety of other things. And I think it's because I am one of the few limnologists who have actually started talking about some of the strange things that happen in lakes. And I'll tell you kind of how I got into this and why there's some justification for me to do this as a professor or as a scientist. And that is that, I don't know if you studied a lot about carbon cycling, but I'm really interested in carbon processing in various lakes and how they do things like bury carbon and evade it to the atmosphere. And I've done a lot of work recently on methane loss to the atmosphere and stuff like that. But I also got really interested in the burial of carbon in sediments. And you can see the kind of littleish, this is for oligotrophic and mesotrophic lakes. You can see this sort of little arrow. I mean, 0.23 petagrams is still a lot globally, but it's a kind of a smallish arrow compared to what pours into lakes from the terrestrial environment. But lakes are kind of net gas emitters, but they are also really big organic carbon sinks. And that's why I kind of got interested in this question of burial. And here's something on carbon processing in eutrophic lakes. And you see that arrow is bigger. And a lot of organic matter gets buried down in the sediments and in various places in lakes. And that causes them to have really interestingly strange and spooky behavior, which I kind of got into later after I was messing around with gas fluxes and stuff. So just to show you, there's some scientific justification for my messing around with this, although it's not always necessary because actually science should be fun before anything else. So the thing is, when you pour more carbon into a lake, it tends to cause a lot more carbon to get buried for really long periods of time. And so there are two reasons that sediments build up fast in lakes. The first reason is there's a lot of carbon delivered to them through erosional losses from landscapes and other places like falling out of boats and things like that. And primary production tends to be pretty high. And the second reason is that organic matter is extremely well preserved, often for millennia in lakes. So it stays there for a really long time. And this is where we sort of get into some of the more spooky bits. And we know that aquatic systems preserve sediment carbon really well. And I'm going to tell you two stories and then a bunch of other stories. But first, I'm going to talk, well, I'll talk about hanged Danes. This is Tolland Man, who was hanged and tossed into a bog. But first, I'm going to talk about drowned Deans, which as an academic, of course, I can kind of get into a little bit more. And both of these I call examples of coarse particulate carbon burial. Okay, so and I ran across this some years ago when on Halloween when I was looking at a newspaper and I saw a story about people camped out in front of the tomb of Mabel Douglas in New York City. And Mabel Douglas there on the bottom, she was a dean of New Jersey College for Women, which later became part of Rutgers University. And among other things, she was rather reclusive and not particularly well-liked, but that is often the case with deans. And when she, before the holidays in 1933, here you see two news stories. In 1933, she went out searching for pine boughs and in a little rowboat and was never heard from again, although they found the boat bobbing around in Lake Placid in New York. So, but then in 1963, some divers were doing a deep dive down to 100 feet or so, and they found a body on the bottom of Lake Placid. And actually, I probably should have pulled out the photos of what it looked like, but the body was essentially perfectly preserved. And this made people kind of concerned that, but well, they first thought it was a murder. I mean, because that's, you find a dead person in a lake, you think, must be murder. But in fact, they pulled her out and identified her in various ways. And they had a coroner who actually was a veterinarian, but the coroner checked her out, did an autopsy, and found that in fact she was mostly made of soap. She wasn't made of skin and as much as she was made of soap. But the coroner ruled this an accidental death, but she had a 50-pound anchor around her neck. So I'm not sure it was accidental. Might have been kind of on purpose. But so the dean was lost in a lake at 30 meters depth and recovered after 30 years without any decomposition. And it really kind of freaked people out because this woman had essentially, they felt sort of come back from the dead, just sort of failed to decompose. So this is an example of what's called saponification, lacustrine saponification. And if you have cold conditions and basic pH, something, above 7, and, often lakes are in pH of 8 or so, then bodies saponify. And here's a saponified body on the top, some bloating, of course, but, and actually this creepily, I found this on the web, the top one, and it was for sale, which I found really peculiar. Yeah, that's really gross, isn't it? So that's a saponified body, and then there's another one they're hauling out of I think an old airplane that had crashed into Lake Tahoe. But if you kind of start looking at the news records, you find that places like Lake Tahoe are rumored to be filled with hundreds of bodies suspended in deep water, and that's really creepy if you're diving. But the legend goes that there were a lot of the Chinese railroad workers back in the 1800s who were deemed somehow expendable and were drowned somehow. I'm not sure in Lake Tahoe, not sure of the whole story. But even more recently, there was a guy named Donald Christopher Windecker, a scuba diver. I think this is from a story in the early 20-teens, in full scuba gear, and was found at 265 feet, 17 years after he disappeared, found in Tahoe. It's just general that Lake Tahoe is really great for getting rid of bodies, but so are all kinds of other lakes. There's a lot of preservation by saponification and preservation of carbon. And these are bodies that show up decades after they actually disappeared. So I find that pretty creepy. I've not discovered one myself. And then there's another way this all happens that you might be interested in. I talked about hanged Danes. And this is a hanged Dane. It actually looks a lot like a famous limnologist I know. But this body was found in a bog. Now, bogs are really acid pH, right? And they're full of organic matter. And these organic acids will tan a body like leather. This guy, Tollenman, was hanged, I don't know, I can't remember, 1400 years ago, something like that. And his body was tossed into a bog. And he looks so real that they thought when they found him that it was a recent murder again. But in fact, the clothing and everything else was sort of carbon dated back a long time ago. So here we have Tollenman, but there are literally thousands of lakes and bogs that have gobbled up people over time and then spit them back out in really frightening ways. So the images on the bottom I ran into, these are facial reconstructions of a series of bog mummies and that were sort of rebuilt, but you find them everywhere. And if you're interested at all in this, you can go on the New York Times. I mean, if you're just really morbid and creepy, like I apparently am, you can go in the New York Times list and New York Times archives and search for bog mummies, and they're just all over the place. And you find them in virtually every country that has any kind of bogs. And it's just because these corpses are being tanned, but then they give them up decades to millennia later, fully formed. And this guy was so well preserved that they analyzed his stomach contents. And I'm not really sure if hanging was worse than what they were feeding the poor guy. It was a gruel made of like 11 grains or some horrible thing like that. And possibly really full of fiber, but probably the last meal was not all that appetizing. But there he is, and looks a lot like one of my friends, which is a little strange. So there are lots of other cases of extreme rates of limnological carbon conservation that you can run across, and lots of things are preserved for decades in lakes. That photo on the top there is logs that were preserved in perfect millable condition in Lake Superior, down in lake sediments, actually in the harbor not far from where I am here on the north shore of Lake Superior. The preservation of organic matter is the foundation of paleolimnology, as you may already have learned. But one of the stories I think is really interesting and disgusting is this one about how ancient people preserved meat over periods of time. You can imagine that a mastodon had really a lot of meat on it, more than the people could actually eat in any period of time, any reasonable period of time before it spoiled. So they used to cut these animals apart and put them down in lakes, on the bottom of lakes, and preserve whole animals in those environments. And this was actually, there's an article by Nemechek in Science in 2000 on this deal, but there was an archaeologist who was digging this stuff up, and he had a bunch of graduate students out there. And just as they were packing up for the season in the autumn, there was a horse that was hit by a truck out on the highway near them. And they thought, well, let's run the experiment. So they basically butchered the horse and put it down in the pond that they were working on, and came back in the spring and set up camp again to do some more archaeology. And they pulled out the horse and they grilled it. And according to the guy, a major professor involved in this, he said the graduate students who ate it, note that they were graduate students, thought it tasted slightly sour, but was perfectly well preserved down the bottom of the lake. So things hang around in lakes for a long time. So my next story isn't really about like dead people coming out of lakes. It's about a true monster and preservation of his life and things that he did in his life. And I don't know if you've heard of Caligula, but he was one of the Caesars of Rome, and he was incredibly cruel and vicious. But when I was flying into Rome one time, I was giving a talk to the Department of Agriculture, weirdly, in Rome, and that was about carbon preservation. I flew over this lake called Lago di Nemi, and this is an excellent example of carbon burial in lake sediments. And you can see an old woodcut lithograph on the top of this Lago di Nemi, which is has a great big boat in the center of it. It's a really large boat. And that is a representation of Caligula's big party boats. So his name is Gaius Caesar, but they called him Caligula. And he had these two big party boats that were about the length of a football field, just incredibly big. And they had plumbing and all kinds of other stuff. And he'd have these. Oh, I didn't show you. You were looking at the wrong thing. Sorry. I was looking at this right slide. There's a boat in the middle of Lake Nemi, and you can see kind of where it is. The red dot shows where it is with respect to Rome. And he had these huge party boats out there, and some of the people didn't survive the parties. They were that incredibly monstrous. For the limnological parts, Lake Nemi is a dimictic lake, which I'm assuming you all know what that means by now. Nutrients are pretty high, so it's pretty productive. So it's got a lot of organic matter in it. The deep waters are only periodically anaerobic. So this isn't a question of anaerobiosis. It's about, 100 feet deep, 30 meters or so, and really long residence time, very small catchment area. But this is Lago di Nemi. But so it was rumored, divers found on the bottom of this. Oh, sorry, I should tell you, Caligula, the monster, had these two big, large ships out there for parties, and they were sunk in 41 AD, but they were recovered completely, perfectly preserved in 1932. So they were sunk actually after Caligula was killed by 30 of his closest friends by stabbing. They finally decided he wasn't all that fine of a personality. So they murdered him, and then they sunk his boats. But they stuck around till another dictator showed up, who was Mussolini. And Mussolini decided that he wanted to recover these symbolic boats of debauchery. And so he tried to raise them with divers. In the 1930s, of course, that was pretty hard to do. But then finally he decided sort of the ultimate way to get these boats would be to simply drain the lake. So he had the army drain the lakes, and they pulled these boats out, and they were preserved in a great big museum next to Lago Nemi, but they were in perfect condition. I mean, the wood would still be millable just because this lake held on to them for so long. So lots of things, monstrous people and other people who disappear but come back basically from the dead make lakes a really spooky kind of place. Now, the last kind of thing I want to talk about, I think, is lake ghosts. And I don't know, if you Google lake ghost or haunted lake, you will find literally thousands of lakes that are reported to have ghosts. So lake ghosts are very, very common. And the lake ghosts are not content to simply haunt people and frighten them. They also seem to want to kill them. Lake ghosts are often thought to kill the living in some sort of, I don't know if it's revenge, or is it they're lonely, they'd like company, don't know. But I mean, you guys have one right next to you there, supposedly, right? Isn't there, Lake Champlain has a vengeful witch that tries to kill people. This is a ghost witch, tries to kill people in Lake Champlain, but hundreds of other lakes are thought to be haunted by ghosts. And so the ghosts are haunting and frightening, but also seem to lure people into the water and kill them by drowning. I live on the Great Lakes, but no more lakes have more ghosts than the Great Lakes. And this includes entire ships that reappear having sunk with their ghost crews aboard, haunting people. And but there are lots of other ghostly lakes around, and it made me wonder, why do people seem to see ghosts around lakes? And so I, of course, reverted to limnology, as I often do. There may be a scientific explanation for this, and there's a phenomenon called will-o'-the-wisp, and I don't know if any of you have ever seen this. It's a glowing kind of fire that comes up out of the water and floats across the surface of water. And the will-o'-the-wisp, it's sometimes called fairy fire, a bunch of other things. In fact, the English name for it in the old days was jack-o'-lantern, which is where the word jack-o'-lantern comes from, is that it comes from this will-o'-the-wisp. Now, I think that the chemistry of this is pretty straightforward, although I've never really worked on trying to detect this stuff. But if you oxidize phosphine, which is pH 3, or diphosphane, which is P2H4, in the presence of methane, then the phosphine and diphosphane should spontaneously combust really slowly the methane that's coming off of lakes and ponds. And I don't know if you've read any of my recent stuff, but there's a lot of methane coming out of lakes. And it's just the conditions for the creation of phosphine and diphosphane that are curious to me. And these will-o'-the-wisp are supposed to look like sort of a lantern in the woods around water. And people in the old days, when there really wasn't much skylight, people would think that it was indication of a house or something, a lit house, or somebody walking with a lantern, and they'd go toward it and often drown. So I'm wondering if all these reports of ghosts are not just will-o'-the-wisp phenomena in lakes. People don't see will-o'-the-wisp very often anymore, and I think that's due to increased skylight. But the conditions for creation of this stuff are pretty straightforward. It only takes a reducing environment to make phosphine and diphosphane, and also create methane at an oxic and anoxic interface. And this is all can be produced easily through decay of organic matter, and can cause light and glowing, which I think would frequently be mistaken for ghosts. And sometimes you can see in the sort of the simulation on the bottom, these things look kind of ghostly. They could have some sort of form. So the rest of the chemistry you probably don't care about, but I think this is going to be my next research project, is to start looking for phosphine and diphosphane, which I've never really even tried to analyze for, but it'd be interesting to see what the overall conditions for ghosts and ghost formation might be. So in conclusion, lakes are definitely they're the spookiest places on Earth. They're also the most beautiful places on Earth, which attracts people in. They are Earth's eye, as was written in Walden, and but they are spooky. They preserve the dead for very long periods, and there are a couple of different biogeochemical processes that do that, and those are tanning and saponification. So you'll never be surprised if bodies come floating up that have been gone for a long time. They also preserve all kinds of other large particulate matter, like trees, wicked party boats, mastodons, and so on. But lakes are increasingly famous for having ghosts and monsters. And I think there's a monster in Champlain as well, but I didn't even try to touch on the monsters. There are just too many of them. But the ghosts are, I think, a little bit easier limnologically. Maybe there's a scientific explanation for this, or maybe it doesn't need one. I wish you all a very happy Halloween.